Hello, this is Insight from the studios of ESAT, Washington, D.C. Today, I have two guests. The subject we will explore will be U.S. West policy, helpful or harmful. To discuss these issues, I have two distinguished guests. Ambassador Tibor Nagy, former U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for Africa, and also former ambassador to Guinea and Ethiopia. Welcome, Ambassador.
Very much for having me.
And Professor Fitz-Gerald. Professor Anne is director of Balsillie School of International Affairs, and she is also professor of international security. Professor Anne has worked in Ethiopia for many years. Welcome, Professor.
Thank you for having me.
I'm going to start with the ambassador. When war broke out about 13 months ago, you were the Assistant Secretary of State. So when you look back to the 13 months, has the U.S. policy achieved its goals?
No, absolutely not. If we want to judge it on good intentions, then I would obviously give it an A+. But if you want to judge it on results, then obviously it has not at all achieved the results, because from day one, the intent of U.S. policy was to end the conflict as quickly as possible and to end the suffering. And unfortunately, it has just gotten worse and worse and worse where we are today.
Professor Anne, you want to chime in on that? And if you agree with the ambassador, why did it not work?
Well, I can confirm that I do agree with the ambassador. I think intentions have always been good in the region of the Horn of Africa on the part of the U.S. government, especially when it comes to humanitarianism and the pursuit of development goals. However, I think part of the problem has had to do with the narrative and the words that were used very early on in the conflict that shaped and informed the policies, most of which, in my view, were very short-termist in nature and very incoherent, that were followed with disastrous effects on the ground. And I think two examples that I would use are the events around the provisions and the arrangements surrounding the aftermath of the unilateral ceasefire, and what should have been a realization that humanitarian goals are very incompatible with the goals of armed insurgencies. And so this was leaving particularly the region of Tigray, but also northern Ethiopia more broadly, in a fairly dysfunctional, unworkable situation with regards to the humanitarian provision. The second thing I would highlight would be the lack of punitive measures afforded to all parties to the conflict. And it hasn't been lost on any of us that the party who started the conflict, who expanded the conflict, and which has in many ways prolonged the conflict, has not had any punitive measures launched towards it.
Mm-hmm. Ambassador, you were the U.S. Assistant Secretary of State at the time, and you did acknowledge TPLF started the war, and there has been some evolutions since the Biden administration took over power. Some of the narratives, as Anne said, some of the languages used seem to have exacerbated the problem, particularly alienated the Prime Minister's side or the Ethiopian side. Do you share that?
Yeah, here's the situation. I fear that the U.S. government started losing some credibility with Ethiopia even before the hostilities started, when during the Trump administration, the U.S. took a pro-Egyptian point of view on the whole issue of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. So that raised a lot of suspicion, so that when the fighting started with Tigray, already I think the Ethiopian government was looking at U.S. motives with some degree of suspicion. But I also remember very clearly the first conversation I had with a high-ranking Ethiopian official the day after the conflict started. And some of the points I made then, if only, I think if the Ethiopians had listened, then the course of events would have been much less negative.
Professor, one of the issues Ethiopians talk about when they talk about not only the U.S. Policy, but the European Union's policy is they seem to equate or look at, create equivalence between an elected government and a belligerent group. Is this normal in international relations?
I think that we could go through, we could spend this entire interview citing examples of where this has not happened, and in fact the opposite has happened. I think if we just all close our eyes for a moment and think of this situation happening on our soil, if in what was a planned, coordinated, unprovoked attack across all outposts of a military base, which takes a long time to plan for and to raise that invisible capacity, that sort of fighting force and belief in your leadership to prepare for. Had that happened anywhere across Western countries, NATO countries, it would have been responded to in a very decisive way. I mean, you see very decisive approaches to diffusing terrorist threats of any sort, even if they're targeted to one person. For example, in Canada, a soldier at the Cenotaph. In the UK, a member of parliament being brutally attacked and killed. And a teacher in France being brutally attacked and brutally beheaded. Those countries, under their anti-terrorist legislation, launched immediate responses, deployed all national instruments of power to do so, and we've also seen in the past countries leverage their cooperative security arrangements with other allies to respond to such things. But of course, with planned, coordinated attacks that are insurgency in nature, will also have a very powerful, if done well, information element to the insurgency effort. And that was certainly the case at a time when the surprise attack was not expected entirely by a government, and when that government did not have even a fraction of the resources and organization behind their information effort. And as a result, really, the Abiy government administration was fighting wolves at the door, disinformation wolves at the door to begin with. And that sometimes has the opposite of effect, where messages become reinforced inadvertently instead of discounted. So, yeah, a long answer to your question, no, this is not normal.
Okay. Ambassador, when I come to you, I want to ask two questions, but I don't know, it requires a lot of time. One is, we don't know what the current administration thinks of its policy. It is solely focused on pressuring or coercive measures, sanctions and diplomatic pressure, international pressure. And Ethiopians do not respond well to pressure. Yes. I mean, since we agree the intentions are good and the policies are not yielding, what should we expect from the policymakers?
Yeah, before we do that, let me just add one thing about the previous topic, because I remember the very first interview I gave BBC when the war started. One of the points I made was that there is not an equivalency between a sovereign state and a region that's in rebellion. And when we talk about cases, the case that I have often raised concerns the US Civil War. And I compared the initial attack by the TPLF on the ENDF Northern Command as the Confederacy launching an attack on Fort Sumter to start the Civil War. So, you know, I absolutely wanted to clarify that. Now, would you please raise your question again?
Yeah, the question is, since the pressure, whether it's sanctions, international or United Nations, didn't work, what are other measures? How can we influence the policy the U.S. is taking, or it's a lost cause?
Yeah, I have, you know, I've worked with many governments and many people, and never have I met anybody who reacts to pressure in a more adverse manner than what I call the Habesha, you know, the Habesha community, whether you're talking about Eritreans or Ethiopians, or it is not, if you want the Ethiopians to go to the right, you tell them, you know, to go to the left. It is like that. And unfortunately, in today's world, sanctions seem to be about the only tool in the international community's toolbox. I mean, one of the most recent sanctions I personally would not have promoted, which was suspending Ethiopia's AGOA status. Because at the end of the day, it's not the leadership that suffers, you know, when you suspend AGOA, it's those mostly women. And one of the U.S. policies is to try to improve the state of women. It's women who are working, you know, in clothing factories in Ethiopia to export clothes. So, yes, unfortunately, in this case, the toolbox has been very limited. International community no longer, you know, intervenes directly in conflicts, whether they're civil wars or interstate conflicts, and it's an extremely limited and unfortunately ineffective tool.
Yeah, Ambassador, I want to stay with you because you might be able to give us what the meaning are. Many Ethiopians do not exactly know what does cessation of hostilities mean. Does that mean that EPLF will stay in the territories they are currently holding? Also, when they talk about start of national dialogue, what does that exactly mean? I have been trying to get a response from the U.S. State Department, the U.S. Embassy in Addis Ababa. I was not able up to now, but maybe you can explain these two terms for us.
You know, my friend, I cannot speak for the current administration.
I know.
And what their definition is. I know, you know, I have been really promoting a ceasefire, but the ceasefire, excuse me, the ceasefire would literally be stop fighting right now, you know, don't shoot another bullet, and then you launch into additional steps as to where the forces would end up. And, you know, but the basic thing is you start with what I call the low-hanging fruit. Because if you want to stop a war, the way to stop a war is to stop fighting, and then you take it further as to where the armies end up and, you know, additional points. As far as a national dialogue, that is a difficult one. Because there can be many, you know, definitions of what entails in a national dialogue. So I'm not going to touch that one.
Yeah, we encourage and we welcome the State Department, Ambassador Feldman's office, to come and explain this to Ethiopians. Professor, I want to come to you. I will stay with the cessation of hostilities. You have lived in Ethiopia. I am originally from Ethiopia. The people of Amara or the people of Afar will never accept to be under the armies of the TPLF for 24 hours. So such a request as cessation of hostilities seems to legitimize the conquerance or the territory TPLF conquered to be under them. What do you think?
I take a very straightforward and simple view to this issue. First of all, the Prime Minister, having agreed to a unilateral ceasefire and pulled back beyond Tigray's borders would see it as a dereliction of his duty, and more importantly, his people would see a dereliction of his duty not to protect the other regions from insurrectionist movements. And that's in fact what we've seen with the expansion of the conflict. Before the unilateral ceasefire, it was quite contained around the Tempe and Kolo area. But with the drawback of troops, which was described by the media as a big win for the TPLF and the TPLF's military campaign. I mean, the crux of the issue is you can't fight an insurgency war without the risk of civilian casualties, because it is known for a very good reason as the war amongst the people. So in addition to the pressure on the Ethiopian government by the international community, it pulled back. But the counter narrative to a cessation of hostilities when there is an insurrectionist force in an area whose interests you're supposed to be defending and the people's safety and security is that the government sits back and lets mass rapes, death, destruction, displaced, looting carry on and to do nothing. And that's just unacceptable. So I believe in a cessation of hostilities, but in order to do that, there needs to be incentives on both sides. The incentive on the government side would, of course, be for no further TPLF or Tigrayan fighters coming across the border and invading other regions. The incentive on the TPLF side would be to stop fighting, and nothing, no calls from European leaders, no calls from US leaders to ceasefire and to draw back. And even these calls were a long time in coming to draw back from the Amhara and the Afar regions. Nothing has incentivized it to stop its forward advanced efforts. Nothing has stopped it from mass recruitment of humans of all different segments of society, elderly, high school students, university students, children, men, women. Nothing has stopped that recruitment and that forward movement. So you've got to think of a plan B. Plan A is not working, so what's plan B? And without any punitive measures lodged towards them, an entity which, let's remember, has foreign assets overseas, has overseas properties, to at least even threaten sanctions of some sort may just make a difference. And we haven't seen that so far. So as a result, it's not just emboldening an insurgency, but it is causing killing fields in Tigray, let alone in Amhara and Afar. And I think that's a concept that has to be acknowledged, accepted, and plan B to move forward, because plan A is not working.
As you can hear me? Okay. As Ambassador Feltman was kind enough to come on the show, after that he is traveling to Turkey and United Arab Emirates. He has also traveled to Sudan in the past trips and Kenya. So I want to ask you, what is the purpose of these travels? I mean, there is a widely reported that Ethiopia is getting arms from UAE and Turkey. The GERD issue might be the issue with Egypt and Sudan. But what exactly is the ambassador trying, or the US is trying to achieve by traveling around Ethiopia?
I can't speak for Ambassador Feltman. I suspect that the United States is extremely eager to explore and try any means possible to bring this to some kind of a conclusion. So it is absolutely consultations, getting ideas from everybody who might have some influence with Ethiopia. And I also wanted to add one other thing on the ceasefire. If we remember, when there was a ceasefire in World War I, German troops were still occupying most of Belgium and parts of northern France. So the actual status of forces when the ceasefire occurs does not mean at all that's where they're going to end up.
No, I agree with you. But I just want to reiterate what the ambassador said. The ambassador is a retired diplomat. He has served for many years in the U.S. Department. He does not speak for the U.S. government. So when I ask these questions, I'm asking him in his personal capacity for his opinions that is derived from his extensive experience. But Ambassador, if the U.S. is willing to get help to stop this, if they are desperately in need of help, why don't they speak to Ethiopians? We in the Washington area, there are like 100,000 diaspora Ethiopians, engineers, scientists, rich people, business owners. We go to the State Department in tens of thousands. We just submit a letter. Nobody really talks to us extensively. We vote. In Ethiopia itself, there are a lot of Ethiopians that can contribute. Why concentrate on foreign countries that are very loose connection to Ethiopia rather than Ethiopians?
All I can say is that when this started, one of our recommendations was definitely to engage the diaspora. Now, you also, when my window used to look right down on the street where people demonstrate. And it seemed like every day there was a loud demonstration, and I would send somebody down to come back and tell me, okay, today, is it the Amhara? Is it the Oromo? Is it the Tigrayans? Is it those in support of the government? You know, unfortunately, with the way this thing is going, I mean, we all know how inflamed the feelings are, and that they're getting more and more inflamed every single day as there's additional atrocities, additional human rights violations on all sides. And it becomes extremely difficult to get any kind of objective views on, you know, that's just reality.
Professor, I want to come to you. Another avenue for pressuring Ethiopia is the United Nations and its many organizations. As you know, the UN Security Council has debated Ethiopia 12, 13 times. And tomorrow, the United Nations Human Rights Commission will hold a meeting about Ethiopia. I'm pretty sure there are many other countries with worse human rights record, with dictatorship at the helm. Why is so much pressure coming from Europe? And also, if you want, the State Department had a press release a couple of days ago. They seem to think the TPLF human rights abuses are unconfirmed. I'm quoting. I don't know if you saw that. What do you think about this?
Well, I think that there was a process in place. A joint investigation team was put together, which included the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights Office, together with the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission. And that process and that report was heralded by many as a model process, model methodology. There were shortcomings, as there are with all processes that take place in areas under conflict. Indeed, there were access to certain places that were questioned. There was the issue of collateral damage that wasn't enumerated. There was the issue about all these ENDF and EDF uniforms that were manufactured in Tigray, the impact of which was not discussed. But what was clear was that atrocities, and some dreadful atrocities, were committed by all sides. And secondly, what was clear was that, as in the 1980s, the issue of genocide was discounted. And I think that this disappointed some human rights advocates and other groups. And these external actors, we've seen this week, have pushed through different means to revisit some of those issues. And so it doesn't seem that they are no longer behind this process that was modeled by the Joint Investigation Team. So we've seen lots of articles coming out. In fact, Amnesty International's most recent article on Western Tigray was published not as a report, but as an article, and interestingly done jointly with Human Rights Watch. We've seen articles published by journalists like Declan Walsh with the New York Times, with a very questionable investigative base, having relied on one person who he claims was a top official, who he claims was privy to military planning. Neither is true, is the case. And I think if the reporter had looked at the deployment patterns in advance of the law enforcement or supporting the law enforcement operation, and also spoken to people who he mentions in the article and who were privy to military planning, the article would have appeared much differently. So I think what we're seeing, interestingly enough, Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the UN, issued an end-of-year statement today, and I listened to it, and interestingly, Ethiopia wasn't mentioned, and nor did it come up in the questions. Joseph Borrell, the Special Representative for the European Union, has also tried on 2 occasions to push through sanctions. Both times have failed. Countries like Germany have opposed it. And so Europe is not united either, but I think this meeting that's been pushed for tomorrow, that has been sort of carefully staged and promoted and managed, is being described on social media as akin to the Berlin Conference of 1884. And something that is very a colonial type effort, and with no Africans on board supporting this effort, the legitimacy of it is questionable and is being questioned.
Ambassador, I want to come to you. You talked about looking out of your windows, and you talked about the inflamed tensions within Ethiopia. And this is, to me, the root cause of the problem. The root cause of the problem is the ethnic politics, if you will, that Meles Zenawi, and I will add, with the help of the United States and the European Union, that was established in Ethiopia. The US and the world has experienced identity politics, whether it was ethnicity in former Yugoslavia or religious identity in Iraq, to some extent in Yemen, did not work. And I can also add Lebanon did not work. Why wouldn't the US realize the underlying tension between these ethnic groups derived from the current constitution, and encourage a new constitution, a new order, but also strengthen the federal government? In Ethiopia, most of us see if the federal government were to lose, there will be multiple horizontal ethnic wars. I'm sure the US government realizes this. You were there when the war broke out. This information is clear, right?
Yeah. Before I talk about that, let me just mention one thing about the human rights violations, because that has been very, very much on my heart. Unfortunately, international community does not apply the same standards to all human rights violations. You know, if Israel does something wrong, everybody comes down on them. But if China can, mistreat millions of Uyghurs, and the international community does not seem to care as much. So I wish it was otherwise, but it's not. I mean, at the end of the day, the poor farmer that's killed, or the poor woman who's raped, when that happens, they're dead and they're raped. And is it the TPLF? Is it the Ethiopian forces? Is it the Eritreans? Is it, who knows at the end of the day? But one of the things that has really bothered me about this is that the larger Habesha community, they seem to only see the violations that are committed by the other side. They don't seem to be bothered by what is done by their own side. So, you know, I'll leave it at that. Now, on the federalism, ethnic federalism, the United States of America, as I'm sure most of the West, was so happy to see Mengistu overthrown at the time that I think the last thing anybody was going to do was to, you know, butt into what kind of a state was going to be created out of Mengistu's Ethiopia. So, you know, it was an academic exercise. If Ethiopia wanted to try what they refer to as ethnic federalism, then so be it. There was really no, you know, attention given to try to persuade or convince the winners of that particular civil war from going off in that direction. And as we know, there is a wonderful model for ethnic federalism which works fantastically well. I often ask my students about it, and none of them have ever guessed which country it is, but it's Switzerland, where you have three ethnic groups that have historical enmity towards each other, but they get along great. Of course, the big difference is Switzerland is filthy rich, and those people are dividing riches instead of poverty.
Yeah, but Ambassador, I think we discussed this. One significant difference is there are 26 cantons. And I looked at the constitution. In Ethiopia, land, there is no meaning of citizenship, Ambassador. Land is not owned by the citizenry. Land is owned by this ethnic group or that ethnic group. That's a significant difference.
Yeah, it is. And that was one of the areas of debate that I had with my old friend Melis on an ongoing basis. You know, there were three big areas that I always argued with him. One was private ownership of land. One was the telecom, that it should be privatized, and the other was to allow international banking institutions.
Yeah, but Ambassador,
I want to one was private land.
I want to go back to the previous point. When Meles came to power, I can understand the euphoria or whatever we want to call it, but an institution like the U.S. Department, EU, that have experience in human history, while they can be happy about the short term of TPLF coming to power, but how come they didn't see the dangers of ethnic federalism? And why should we believe them today when they tell us they have better solutions than us?
Well, I can't speak again for the U.S. government today. I haven't seen anybody saying that they have a better solution on state creation. But I can tell you that just was not an issue for the U.S. government when the TPLF, EPRDF came into Addis Ababa as to what kind of a state they were going to form.
Professor, I want to come to you. As you already touched on it, the international media, human rights organizations, the different tentacles of the Western powers, they seem to move in the same direction. They do not see any merit in the narratives coming out of not only the Ethiopian government, but in thousands of Ethiopians demonstrating in the capitals of around the world. So that raises the question of, are these really media independent? Are human rights organizations independent? How would you explain this to Ethiopians?
I don't think many organizations are completely independent these days. All organizations rely on ways of functioning and operating and resources in their budget to prop up their human resource complements. And those resources come from different sources, right? That's why we have the term quangos as well as bongos and gongos when we describe NGOs, like government-orientated NGOs, business-orientated NGOs, quasi-government NGOs that really, really rely on government funding, but sort of maintain independence per se. So there are always interests at heart. The media is a big profit game as well, and so lots of money in that industry. And I think that this is why it's very, very important to make sure policy is based on well-informed analysis, because once you make these declarations or statements of intent, it's very difficult to come down from those platforms that you've created. And there were platforms that were created very early on in this conflict, statements, and if they're dismissed now, people lose face, and people have to accept that grave mistakes were made and put their hands up and say, we have to rethink this. And we're just not seeing the readiness across the international media actors or the international policy world to do that. I think hard positions were taken, hard positions were cemented. There's some serious face saving that would have to go on to come down from those perches. And, Ambassador Nagy talked about the tools in the international peace and security toolbox and the default to harsh sanctions. I mean, there's a lot that we can do in the middle as well. We want democratic regimes. The international community welcomed the political transition in 2018 in Ethiopia. The international community was instrumental in advising Ethiopia to delay its election due to COVID and due to the practice that was followed by 78 other countries in the world, something that's often not brought into the argument. And also the reforms that were launched to begin with were very much supported too. Things can get messy when there are democratic transitions, particularly in the unique case where there is a massive transition within the same party. I mean, part of the reason why we had problems concerning ethnic identities, etc., was because of the way the coalition government was structured. It did not give a voice to 5 other regions in the country, soon to become 6, and that was change. I mean, change was brought about to try to enable that. And when you're beaten out of office and removed from office, the democratic thing to do is to gracefully step down and bow out. And instead, there was a determination to try to grab back power and try to beat the drums again. And this is more. It's about more than ethnic identity and power politics. It's to do with finances, it's to do with economics, and so it's a much more complex situation.
Mm-hmm. Ambassador, our time is coming to a close, so I want to give you a chance on President Biden's Summit of Democracies or Democracy Summit. As you know, Ethiopia was not invited, but Philippines was invited. Turkey was not invited, neither was Hungary, but Nigeria and other countries were invited. I don't know whether you saw the New York Times piece. There was a long piece how it didn't go well. Any opinions you want to share?
Yes, sir. I have an op-ed coming out this Sunday that I write op-eds every other week for the West Texas newspaper. Mm-hmm. And I have one coming out saying Biden summit, democracy or hypocrisy. I was really okay. I'm a Hungarian American, so this is personal, not objective. But I was astounded that Hungary, the only member of the EU and NATO, they're member of both, was not invited, and there were countries with much poorer records that were. And now, having said that, I think it was a great time for a democracy summit. Democracy's in trouble. We've seen the reports. We've seen Freedom House ratings and things like that. But maybe it will have what we call legs and will become a process that will go on. but in my view, it was not a good start at all.
Professor Ann, I want to give you a chance and look forward, maybe 6 months, a year. What do you see briefly?
The last point, too, that I think hypocrisy has become quite a central theme in issues concerning Ethiopia and democracies more generally. Hypocrisy, double standards, and selectivism. And I think at the highest, most strategic level of any conversation on democracy, there has to be a way of acknowledging this and to try to be less selective in how we pursue humanitarianism, how we pursue international laws and conventions. And, we have to do our best to eradicate selectivism to win back trust again. So moving forward, is that what you asked me?
Yes.
How would I see moving forward? Well, we haven't heard much news from the battle space, as many refer to it as, over the last few days. But look, I think the people have voted in Ethiopia. 80% roughly of those eligible to vote voted for a democratic future. And with this has to come in an absolute way, not in a partial way, all of those central pillars underpinning democracy. I think what's really important in the North is rebuilding the area, getting critical services back established again, medical services, banking, electricity grids, all of those things that have been damaged multiple times in some cases by the conflict. And that gives people a sense of protection, safety, and security. And you have to cater for the people in this case. Secondly, there has to be some element of plural politics that is brought to the Tigray region if it is going to stay as part of Ethiopia, which we all desperately hope is the case. I mean, Tigray has played such an important role in Ethiopia's history, in history going back to ancient times, and is home to some wonderful people and wonderful communities. And if they are staying as part of the country, that democratic pathway that the people have chosen has to be acknowledged in that region too, and plural politics is a big part of it. It is a region that has been used to an authoritarian governance culture for many years that hasn't allowed for plural politics. So legitimate opposition parties have to be welcomed, platforms for debate, discussion, civil society engagement, the same way that we saw around the recent federal elections, have to be paved way for. There has to be a lot of support for reconciliation and social programs, alternative livelihoods for fighters, and even the municipal authorities and regional authorities who are, for the most part, very decent people who have just found themselves caught up in circumstances beyond their control. I have friends who are affiliated with the TPLF and have been for years who just do not and never have agreed with what's happening. So I think a magnanimous approach to giving, to holding those who committed high crimes accountable, but also to granting blanket amnesty, and also to reforming the security sector for sure. I mean, the issue of having regional militia accountable to a regional president is not good and is grounds for conflict if there's ever a disagreement between the regions and the center. In Canada, which is another federal democratic country, we have it regularly where the leader of a province comes from a different political party than the prime minister. And can you imagine if they had provincial militia under them, and there was a disagreement at the political level, then that's grounds for the armed entities to go to war. So that needs to be changed. And yeah, this notion of a national dialogue, I mean, it seems to be forgotten on many people that national dialogue efforts of sorts have been ongoing for the last 2 years in Ethiopia. Those need to be truly national and involve everyone. They can't be rushed. It will take another 10 years at least to rebuild the social fabric in Ethiopia. And the government needs to be very honest about the time required for this and the investment that needs to be put behind it just to manage people's expectations. And if this has to be done by way of putting some economic reforms and other big aspirations to the wayside, then so be it. The social fabric and the human capacity of a country is the most important thing. It gives the country its resilience. It gives the country its unity. It allows the country to take charge of its own challenges and not pave way for external actors to come in and try to manage them for it. So
thank you very much. Before we close, Ambassador, look forward. What do you see? I can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I agree absolutely with the professor's wise words. You know, I said initially that the TPLF would not make it into Addis Ababa. And I remember a lot of people disagree. I say now, again, that in reverse, it's very, very difficult to physically occupy and defeat Tigray. So to get to that scenario of reconciliation, you really do need to stop the fighting. There are political goals involved on both sides. There are probably unrealistic political goals, and you know the leadership has to recognize that, because until they do, the people are going to continue to suffer. But to me, the most important thing is to find a way right now to stop the fighting so that they can launch into some serious discussions on how to move forward so that we can get back to a real Ethiopian state that will assume its leadership position in the Horn of Africa, because Ethiopia is the key to stability and prosperity in the entire Horn of Africa region, and it can be a wonderful, wonderful example for the rest of Africa, not just for the rest of Africa, but really for the entire world, as to how a country can progress very quickly from the abject state of poverty it was in to a true middle-income country that can be an example to the rest of the world.
Ambassador Tibor Nagy, thank you very much, and Professor Anne Fitz-Gerald, thank you very much. I really appreciate both of you, and hopefully we will see you here pretty soon. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
This has been Insight from ESAT, Washington studios. As usual, I want to encourage people from USAID, the U.S. State Department, from the American Embassy, from the European Union, any Western governments, and intellectuals, think tanks that work on Ethiopia, on issues that are related to Ethiopia, to come and discuss their ideas for Ethiopia. Unfortunately, most of the people that talk on the Western media on Ethiopia are people generally from Great Britain, the Alex Duvalls, the William Davidson, the Martin Plotz. I think we want a broader voice. We welcome as many people as possible to share their views in order to solve the problem that Ethiopia faces today. For today, that was our program. Until next time, bye-bye.